But today is Good Friday, and we've been doing a series called A Lot Can Happen in 7 Days. And it's about the 7 days leading up to when Jesus was crucified and then resurrected. And, you know, there was more in those 7 days than we could go through in 5 or 6 weeks. And so we did, if we go to our background slide for the words today, the green screen, we had Palm Sunday, and we had the Garden of Gethsemane, and we saw about Mary Magdalene around the cross, and then the trial of Jesus. And what we're about to read now is happening just a few moments after Jesus was interrogated by Pilate, and then he was scourged. And for those who are new, Pilate was a Roman governor in Jerusalem who sort of probably was quite a nasty guy. We kind of like him because he washed his hands and said Jesus is innocent, but let's not shy away from the fact that this guy, if you made it this far as a Roman governor, you were probably a pretty brutal person. And so he had Jesus scourged. And the kids are out today, so we're going to talk about what that is a little bit, not too graphic, but what they did, and I'm just going up to what we're about to speak about today. What they did was they tied Jesus to a post about hip height. They found these posts, these whipping posts, and they would whipped him with a whip that had 9 strands and had material woven or put through the strands so that when the whip came down, it would catch the flesh and tear the flesh. And 40 lashings of this was enough to kill most people. And it rendered his front and his back completely devoid of, he would have had his organs showing. It was sort of like a condemnation of death eventually for people anyway. And Pilate thought that would appease them. And we know that by his stripes, that's what it means by stripes, the whips. By his stripes, we are healed. So we as full atonement people believe that when the whip came down, that was like Jesus was taking the punishment for illness and disease and sickness. So by his stripes, we are healed. And when we take his body, which was broken for us, but no bones were broken, but his body that was rent by that whip. And so we have this figure who is then presented before the people, and Jesus, and he's got, of course, the crown of thorns on his head. And again, it says that they beat the crown in with sticks. Can you imagine? They had large thorns and they beat them into his head. And they present Jesus and they mock him. They put a robe on his shoulders and they put him before the people. And the people are so riled up, they say, that's not enough. We know what's happening here. We know that Jesus is taking the punishment for everything we deserve. Right? And so this picture to me makes self-righteousness make no sense. You know, like, oh, I can make it to God. Do we know what we deserve? Right? And so he has this robe, and they've done all other nasty things, and they cry crucify, and Pilate says, okay, well, I guess this is what's happening. I don't want to cause an uproar. I think he was well willing for an innocent man to die to protect his political life. And they place the crossbar of the cross on his back. And an interesting story is that when they were making the Passion of the Christ, that crossbar actually dislocated and broke Jim Caviezel's collarbone. Like this, we think of like a 2x4, but this is a big. And I know this isn't completely biblical, but I like to picture that like a moment when my sin was laid on Jesus. I know that it was laid on Jesus when he was on the cross, and God poured out his wrath for the sin of mankind on Jesus, and Jesus cried out. But for me, it's a moment where I can see that it's like a laying on everything that I've ever done wrong and the mess that I've made it and the mess that Adam made it was placed on Jesus. And this is where we sort of pick up the story in John 19, verse 19. It says, "So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross. He went out to the place of the skull," which is in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Do you want to hear a little interesting thing about Golgotha? Is that it was called place of the skull. And if you go back to the time of David, who's heard of David and Goliath? David did this amazing thing after he killed Goliath with a stone, is that he chopped off Goliath's head and just started running around with it. In fact, when he saw Saul, he's still carrying that head. And then something happens, he gets inspired to run to Jerusalem, which is not a part of the Israelites yet. It's not, they haven't conquered it yet. And he goes outside of the city and he buries the skull. And there's no biblical evidence, but tradition tells us that that place then becomes called the place of the skull, or in Aramaic, Golgotha. Did you know that? So it's not in the word, but tradition would say, I just want to qualify this, that where Jesus was crucified was a statement of, like, that's where Goliath's head was buried. That Jesus was saying, like, he might bruise my heel, but I'm crushing his head in this moment. And Jesus' heel was literally like they drove a nail through it. So, I don't know, just pictures in the word about the fullness of what nothing is by accident. Nothing takes God by surprise. It's all very intentional. So verse 18, there they crucified him, and with two others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fashioned to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read the sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested with Pilate, saying, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather this man claimed to be King of the Jews." Some people have said that if you write Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, acrostically it says Yahweh. So that's maybe why they were upset. Yahweh is the name of God. Pilate said, "What I have written, I have written." He's like, "Don't bother me anymore. I've said that." When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, divided it among them in 4 shares, one to each of them, with the undergarment remaining. The garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. "Let's not tear it," they said to one another. "Let's decide by lot who will get it." This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, "They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." So this is what the soldiers did. You know that I did have the exact amount, but there's hundreds of little sayings and things that Jesus completely fulfilled. And why do I say all this? I think the Bible always tells us it was done so that it might be fulfilled. It's like God's not making this up on the fly. This is what's needed to liberate man from sin. This is what's needed to get rid of the debt that we owed. And the Bible is telling us this is done because God's thought of every angle. This is watertight. God is like the best lawyer that ever existed, and he made sure that everything was done. And he orchestrated everything to happen. It says, verse 28, later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so the scripture would be fulfilled. There it is again. Jesus said, "I am thirsty." A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of a hyssop plant, and lifted it up to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. You know, we've been doing a lot can happen in 7 days. And all of this moment of activity, it's loud, it's boisterous. Jesus is causing a ruckus in the city, and it's all led to this moment. And if you read the other Gospels as well, it says that even when Jesus is crucified, there's a lot happening. And the religious people are talking, and they're throwing insults, and even the people who are condemned with him on the cross are talking, and it's all very loud and ruckus. And then it says at 12 o'clock, everything just becomes silent. And everyone silence befalls them all. And this eerie darkness falls on them. And Jesus does and says a few things like, "My Father, why have you forsaken me?" And it's at this moment that the whole combination of all God's plan is coming into effect. And all of the prophecies and all of the time taken for God to deliver the story of God is happening in this moment. And Jesus is now suffering for our sin. And the punishment we all deserve is being put onto him. And you know, we can talk about the brutality of the cross, that they had 6-inch spikes that they would drive into their wrist, because if it was in the palm, you know how we always see the palm? It's not in the palm, because if it's in the palm, it slips out. They need bones to stop it. It's weight. And they would get a 12-inch spike, and they'd place their legs one over the other, and they would drive that spike through both heels. And there's excavations where they've found this happening to people, and the way that people would die. Remember that Jesus has already been through the half-death, the 40 lashes, and so he's got his back on this wooden cross, and it's bare. And in order to breathe, you have to push yourself up on the spikes that they've driven into you to take a breath, because as you hang there, you start suffocating. You die by suffocation. That's how people die on the cross. It can take days. And so with every breath, he has to hoist himself up on his wounds and on the spikes. And it says, there's a prophecy that says they will look upon him who they pierced. And every time he needs to breathe, he hoists himself up, he takes a breath in, then lets himself back down again. Even the Romans considered this too barbaric after a time. But of course, the significance of the cross doesn't come from the natural suffering alone. In Isaiah 53 verse 6, which is 500 years before Jesus was to be crucified, it says this: "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." God laid on Jesus the punishment that we deserve but couldn't endure. And Good Friday is a humbling moment where I just get stripped of self-righteousness of, I can probably make this, I can make a life, I can get a blessing from God, like I could have done this. It's like, no, when you see what was the penalty for sin, you become very humble. When Jesus went to the cross, he took in himself the punishment and condemnation of all men, but there was more life in Jesus than condemnation in man. So that when he had consumed the judgment, he cried out, "It is finished." The judgment is complete, the punishment is finished, the debt is paid. When Jesus said the word, we're about to look at it, he didn't say "it is finished" because he would have said something in Aramaic, but the Greek word that they translate when he cried out is tetelestai. Who's heard of that word? Yeah? It's a great word. Tetelestai is to do something perfectly, to the maximum ability of that task. It is perfectly perfect, completely complete, paid in full. It was used, actually, the word that he probably said was nagme, which is the word that the priests used to say when the offering was complete. So actually, the same time that he said this, the priests were in offering the sacrificial lamb, saying the same thing as a picture of what he was doing in the outside of the city. However, he cried out this word. Jesus cried out, "It is finished." The payment is finished. Everything that I went through and all of history that came to this point, all of the punishment that was needed for the sin of man has been consumed. That wrecks my mind a little bit, because there's so much wrong with us. But this man, there's another verse in Hebrews that says, "But this man," I love that saying, "But this man, when he had offered one sacrifice for sin forever, sat down at the right hand of God." Jesus, the perfect one, he's the most lovely thing that's ever existed. He came and was marred for us. And at this moment, he had suffered what nobody else could and had endured the punishment that we could not take. And at this moment said, "It is finished," and the wrath of God was satisfied. He said, "It is finished." There's no more payment for sin to those who receive it. You can receive it today. Say, "Jesus, I make you Lord of my life. I receive what you did. I put myself, I take what you did, and I thank you that you took what I did, and I'll take what you did." But at this moment, the story of God had come to a place where God's like, there's a propitiation coming, there's a sacrifice coming, there's somebody coming who's going to make a difference. And they didn't understand he was going to do it. And the idea, like that song said, that there's a God that would take the punishment for us is amazing. I love that song. It says there's a God who weeps and there's a God who bleeds. It is almost to them, it is blasphemy to think that God would bleed for us. And that means so much for us. And here at this church, we spend a lot of time discussing what "it is finished" means, really, essentially, don't we? It's like, this is what grace means. This is what the new covenant means. This is what it means to walk in healing. This is what it means to walk in freedom from your past. This is what it means to overcome sin that seems to be lurking around in your habits. This is what Jesus has done. It's finished. There's no more. It's open to you. But today, I want to look at two things that Jesus didn't say on the cross. And the first thing Jesus didn't say, and we've already talked about this a bit, is, I didn't see that coming. Jesus didn't say, I didn't see that coming. Paul said that Jesus died according to the scriptures. The Bible is clear. There is a price that needs to be paid for sin. And we know that there's a price that needs to be paid for sin. And Jesus, of all people, knew that there's a price that needed to be paid for sin. And there's sort of two ditches that people fall into when they start talking about the gospel. One is that they take away that there's anger for sin. Right? And the Bible is very clear that there is a punishment that needs to be made for sin. There is what the Bible calls is this word that we use, that we don't really use in our English anymore, but I read a New King James Bible. And New King James is like somewhat modern language, but it uses this word wrath. Right? And it's hundreds of times it uses that word wrath. And it's not very PC. We don't like talking about anger against sin, do we? But there's a word. But the reason that we don't like talking about it is because when we see punishment in anger, we think of emotion. Someone that's emotional. Somebody flying off the handle. God's not like that. God is never rash or impulsive. Human anger is an explosive outburst or an emotional eruption against something that we want to pay or seek revenge against. But God's not like this. You see, it's a really hard concept to understand that God has wrath against sin but has love for humanity. I like the way Ken Legg puts it. He said, God's wrath, it is settled, unrelenting, uncompromised opposition to evil. He cannot be passive in regard to sin. Therefore, holiness without judgment upon sin is not possible. God could never tolerate sin and remain holy. I mean, we often make God angry against things we don't like. It's like that must make God angry. And you see that a lot, and it's like, well, maybe that would invoke the anger of God. But God's like, I like the way it says that. It's a settled, unrelenting, uncompromised opposition to evil. And I'm going to tell you why this is a good thing. In Ephesians 2, verse 3 to 5, it says, all of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following the desires and thoughts, and like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. There's that word. But, who loves the buts in the Bible? It's always good when you see that word in there in our English Bible. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in trespasses. It is by grace you have been saved. Here's the thing. There's a punishment for sin. There's a wrath against sin. And we deserve wrath, but we got grace. And we've been speaking about this a bit, and that's why I'm highlighting it today, is like what God's doing on the cross here is he is maintaining his justice. And we all need him to maintain his justice. And we need him to keep his character. And we need him to keep his word and to not compromise. Because if God starts to compromise, everything we have becomes unstable. So on the cross, he's maintaining his justice, right? but extending his love and grace. His mercy sent Jesus on the cross is God's mercy saying, I can't let this go because you don't understand. If I let go what's me, my essence, my nature, then everything's unstable. You need me. You need to be able to be confident in how I'm going to act. So I'm offering this to you. I can keep my nature, which he has every right to and actually needs to, because he's God. And the world is framed by the power of his word, right? But also, I'm so genius that I've created a way where I can extend my love and my mercy and my grace to you. Because God doesn't change, we can always have this word hope. If God compromised on sin, he might compromise on grace. Have you ever thought of that? So one of the ditches that we have is people who take away that there is a sacrifice needed for sin. Otherwise, this whole thing doesn't make any sense. But what some people fail to realize is that God in his love and his mercy kept his holiness, he kept his justice, and extended his mercy. And so mercy really did triumph over justice. But who knows now that justice is working towards us. That because God is just and because he's kept his words, he didn't compromise on the sin thing, so he won't compromise on the grace thing. So Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. The second thing Jesus didn't say is he didn't say, I've done my part. Now you do your part. Another controversial take, I guess. It's all in what he did, and it's actually not in our doing. In Ephesians 2, verse 8, just a few verses down from those ones we just read, it says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of yourselves, it is a gift from God, not by works, so that no man can boast." You see, the Bible's very clear that there's a judgment for sin, and God was desiring to extend grace to us. But grace by its nature is a gift that can't be earned. Or it says, if it could be earned, it's wages and no longer grace. So grace by the nature of the word can't be earned or added to. It can. So here's the problem in our worldly thinking is that we see that we fall short. And we see that we need grace, but then what we do is we be like, well, maybe we should add a little bit of ourself in to grace because that might be honoring to God. But actually, if you read the word, the spiritual dynamic is that you're in one camp or the other. You're either just throw your hat in with works and see where that gets you, but we can see that there's an uncompromised, settled opposition to evil, right? Or you throw all of your confidence into grace and the forgiveness and kindness and righteousness of God. And you can't mix them. When you mix them, that's putting you're putting new wine into old wineskins. And it bursts. You can't do that. We don't use wineskins anymore, so it's a funny analogy. But Jesus used that. He said, you can't get the new wine of grace that I'm about to offer you and put it into old wineskins because it ferments a bit and the wineskin will burst. It doesn't work. And what we do is we pull it down into a rational thinking and go like, okay, it's kind of like, we feel like this. Have you ever missed the bin night? Yeah? And you got this bin, and the bin's just like, it's got 2-week-old prawns in it, right? And you've missed the bin night, and then next time you put it out, and it gets emptied, and who just feels a sense of freedom when that happens? Like, oh, thank goodness I didn't forget again. That's how we feel it is when we come to God. It's like, well, I'm at zero again, the bin's been empty, my sin debt's been put away for now, and hopefully I don't miss next bin day. Because, the other day, we'd been traveling around with these clothes for Vinnie's for like a week. And then you get rid of the clothes from Vinnie's like, oh, thank God. It's like, I've gotten rid of the burden for now, right? I'm at zero. And then I'll put rubbish in the bin and then I'll take it out to the curb of God's forgiveness again. And then it'll get emptied and I'll feel good again. But the Bible says, like, that's madness. That's mixture. And I actually think that's what Jesus throws up out of his mouth. Like, it's insipid to God. Mixture is insipid to God, but that's what we do. But looking at Good Friday and looking at the cross, we can see that it's works or grace. And I'm throwing all of my hope in grace. Because, like, I can look shiny for a moment, but who knows, I know the depth of me. What we establish, we must maintain. If works got us where we need to be with God, then works have to keep us there, and nobody can even get there, let alone keep themselves there. Only by God providing a divine substitute could he simultaneously demonstrate his holiness and his love in forgiving sin. None of God's character or nature were compromised. God's love didn't come at the expense of his holiness. God's justice wasn't put aside to accommodate his mercy. This is the genius of God, that he was able to uphold the two greatest attributes that anyone can have, which is to be completely just. He's God and he's unable to lie. He's unable to compromise his nature, and just the extravagant, uncompromising love of God on the other hand. And God held those two things in tension and he promoted them both. That we can see a holy and just and consistent God on the cross, and we can see, but what's even greater than that is we can see a loving, compassionate God who stoops down, just in the person of Jesus in that moment on the cross, holding these two tensions and just completely keeping them both unfazed. God is so cool, man. He had a plan from the garden. He said, "I'm going to crush your head to the devil." Right? It's from the garden. I've got a plan. It says if the devil had known what he was going to do, they would not crucify the Lord of glory. The devil didn't see what was happening. So good. So we're going to take communion. And I want to go through, just as we're about to take communion, and what I want you to do, if you don't have communion, would you raise your hand and someone can get a communion to you if you forgot to pick it up? I left mine on the chair. I'm going to go grab it in a second. I want to go through Isaiah 53 verses 4 to 7. And then the musos are going to lead us in a song, and then we're going to take communion. So I want you to get your communion in your hand as we speak through these verses, as the musos come up. And they've got this beautiful song, and I'm deliberately left time for the song, 7 minutes, and I'm about 2 minutes behind. You'll forgive me. But Isaiah 53 verses 4 to 7 says, "Surely he has," this is prophetically speaking of Jesus, "surely he has borne our griefs." That word griefs is actually is literally sicknesses. "And he has carried our sorrows." That sorrows is actually physical pain. There's healing in what Jesus did. "Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. We thought that he was struck down by God for himself, but he was struck by God for us. He was wounded." That word wounded means pierced through. "For our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquity." I just want to tell you what this means, because when I first heard someone in the commentary talking about this, it kind of blew my mind. It says that he was wounded, he was pierced through. What happened at the cross? Pierced through for our transgressions. Transgression means to overstep the wrong mark, to go outside of the boundaries of your life. Transgression is an outward sin, that a committal of an action. Transgression is an action. So Jesus was physically pierced through for the actions of sins that we've committed. And then it says he was bruised for our iniquities. Iniquity is an inward corruptness. So transgressions are the things we did outwardly, and iniquities are the things we did inwardly. Don't you think that's cool, that how poetic it is that Jesus was physically pierced for the things we did outwardly, but he's inwardly bled for the things that we did inwardly? He was pierced for the things we did outwardly, bruised is bleeding internally, punished for the inner bankruptcy we have for the things that happen inside of us. The chastisement, the punishment for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned each one to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before the shearers was silent, so he opened not his mouth. He knew what was happening, and he received the punishment. Jesus, right on that cross, the word that we have is tetelestai, which means completely complete or perfectly perfect. So your forgiveness is perfect, your healing is perfect, your blessing perfect, your abundance perfect, your glorification in time to come perfect, your acceptance perfect, your life in Jesus perfect. It is perfectly perfect, completely complete. In every way, the need of man, the need we had, the need we couldn't, the need of man to be reunited with God, completely complete.